Seminar. Today we have the pleasure to have Doan Vu Duc from the Université de Namur, who will give a talk about an interactionist account of the problem of demarcation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a bit emotional for me to be here because I used to be a student here and attend this very seminar for a few years. I'm really also sorry to remind you guys, for the people who know me, that it was 7 years ago, so I guess time flies. But I'm really happy to be here and to present my work for the first time during a long slot for about an hour, so I hope it's going to be okay. I'm so sorry if sometimes I missed a bit of my text, but I'm under medical treatment, so maybe I will sometimes need to read a little bit what I have on my slides. But anyway, let's start. So I'd like to present to you what I call an interactionist account of the problem of demarcation, because it's the point of my PhD thesis. It's on the problem of demarcation between science and pseudoscience. And I'm trying to develop an account that I call epistemic interactionism, and that I believe is empirically informed. And this is why I want to defend, and I hope I can convince you of the view I try to describe. Right. And just to start with, it's a little bit funny because there is this big book on philosophy of pseudoscience that was published in 2013, and the two authors say that philosophers and scientists readily recognize a pseudoscience when they see one. So they look very optimistic about us, philosophers of science, and our ability to see it. And I see it's really funny because last year, like really a few months ago, there was this paper published by a philosopher and a psychologist, I think. It was the result of a study that they conducted, asking participants to categorize certain theories like homeopathy, Freudian psychoanalysis, ancient astronaut theories and such, and categorize them as either science or pseudoscience or anything else. And the results show that philosophers with a PhD do not categorize pseudosciences markedly differently from respondents with lower or no degrees, suggesting that philosophers are no better at identifying pseudosciences than others. And it's a bit important to me because I think that it's really misleading to be optimistic about the ability we have when we discuss and try to analyze and study science or the nature of science or work in the sciences. And it's a bit misleading to believe that we have a certain ability that others wouldn't have. And well, what is misleading is maybe a certain assumption. So I prefer to start with the idea that we might be very bad, in fact, at recognizing and identifying pseudoscientific theories. All right, so that was the very short introduction, but now, as in a really first chapter, I'd like to tackle what is at stake. So, maybe I should have written that, but anyway. So as an introduction, I'm just gonna present a few ideas about what is pseudoscience, what is at stake, and what are the traditional approaches of it. And one of the traditional approaches or definition is from Hansson, who is a huge philosopher on the topic of philosophy of pseudoscience, and he says that a pseudoscience, or rather a pseudoscientific claim, theory, practice, discipline, is a claims practice that is not scientific. And it requires an epistemological work about what it means to be scientific, but so what he means is a variance with the most reliable knowledge about its subject matter that is currently available. And the second property of pseudoscience, or a pseudoscientific claim or a theory or practice, is that its major proponents try to create the impression that it is scientific, which is way more easy to spot, but that property here is, well, way harder, and this is why we need to work as philosophers of science. But so that's the problem, in fact, what it means to be scientific, and I'm not gonna dig too deep into the state of the art and the traditional approaches. What you just need to remember and have in mind is that we usually describe the philosophy of pseudoscience, or rather the debate on the problem of demarcation in philosophy, as starting in the 20th century. And the traditional approaches were really concerned with finding a sole necessary and sufficient criterion of demarcation. And it's a project that has basically failed. But so they started with the idea that we really know what science is, and everyone in philosophy of science should be aware of that. We know and are able to spot easily pseudoscience, and what we need to do is draw a clear line between the two with a necessary and sufficient criterion. So the project didn't work, and at the end of the 20th century, especially with the paper published by Larry Laudan, which is called The Demise of the Demarcation Problem, research on topic, demarcationist research on the topic basically stopped. So demarcationism is the thesis that it is in fact possible to demarcate between science and pseudoscience, and the project sort of stopped with, well, no consensus in mind, no consensus available. The project was considered a dead end. In fact, there has been a study at the end of in the 90s, I think, asking philosophers to say whether they believed it was possible to demarcate, and more than 90% of them believed that it's not possible. So it was considered a dead end. And more philosophers who adopted demarcationism mostly during the 21st century, though it happened a bit before. I started in the 80s, I think. Most of the philosophers adopted gradualism, so the idea that it's not possible to draw a clear line between science and pseudoscience, but that it's possible to demarcate them in a matter of degree, and less of nature, but more of degree. And you have a lot of literature on that, but I don't want to tackle that too much because it's not really my point here. But now what I wanted to do is just to give you a sort of large idea of what is happening and what happens. All right. And what's my take? My take is that traditional demarcationism is based on an empirically inadequate model of rationality. What I mean here is an inadequate model of scientific rationality. And what I want to do with that observation is modeling scientific rationality in a new fashion, and this is what I call epistemic interactionism. All right, and so here is the plan. So I'm going to tackle right now the assumption of individual rationality, which is really the starting point of my research. Present to you the interactionist theory of reasoning, which is a theory of cognitive psychology of Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, who work in Paris at the Institut Jean Nicot. Then define what I call epistemic interactionism. So it's sort of philosophical account based on this psychological theory, and show to you how I suggest we could use it to demarcate between science and pseudoscience with a certain interpretation of this account, which I call pragmatist epistemic interactionism. So this is the plan today for the last, I guess, 50 minutes approximately. All right, so what is the assumption of individual rationality? Thank you. So this section started with the observation that there is a perennial idea in philosophy of pseudoscience, and maybe more in the 20th century, so in the traditional approaches, an idea that suggests that pseudoscience is irrational. Pseudoscience is basically when people believe in pseudoscience or pseudoscientific claims, They are irrational. It's a sort of well, a pseudoscience is a bunch of irrational beliefs and so on. And you even find that in a recent paper. It's not really important, but Stefan Blanke here mentions that pseudoscience and bordering types of irrational beliefs remains rampant and so on. So that idea is present in the literature. And yeah, why do such irrational beliefs remain so popular and persistent? So they start with the assumption that pseudoscience is irrational, and the question is, why does it remain? But maybe it's not that irrational, maybe it's a wrong assumption. And this is what I wanted to tackle. And the counterpart's thesis or claim, either explicit or implicit, is that on the other side, science is rational. You find that very idea, especially in recent papers who analyze the traditional demarcationist approaches to the problem of demarcation and nature of science in the 20th century. The idea that behind the analysis science, there is the idea that science is rational, so that scientists do something rational, and that we being philosophers of science, need to discover what that something is. What is that something that makes scientists being rational when they are doing science? And I think is the next point. Yeah. In this paper, the two authors, so Anderson and Anderson, I guess many people are called Anderson in Scandinavia. The two authors spot what they call the individual rationality assumption. And it's an assumption that makes philosophers of science believe that scientific rationality is a property of how scientists on their own validate their own individual scientific beliefs, especially with using a certain method. What they say is basically traditional approaches like such as Popper's or Hampel's of the nature of science is that scientists have a certain way of being rational, which is validating their own scientific beliefs, and it is adopting a certain scientific methods. So what philosophers need to do is find what that something is, so what that method is, and this is how they read these sort of traditional approaches.
Sorry, is validate here just a synonym for justify, or is something else meant?
I think it's the word they use, but so you say validate.
Justify, I mean, beliefs are usually seen as justified or not.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, probably justify. I think it's the word they use in the paper, so probably this is why I took it, but it might be a sort of a bad choice from me. So yeah, probably justify. So scientific rationality is a property of how
scientists. There's nothing
scientists.
wrong with it, to be clear.
Yeah,
Just
sorry?
I wanted to know whether
Of course,
something specific.
Yeah.
We should ask the native speaker, because I thought that validate is justified publicly, and justify could be personal.
Well, validate implies like a procedure, right? Validate would be about like, what do you do in the lab? You know, how do you go, you have to go do stuff to validate something, right? You can't just like, in the way, you can just be justified in the epistemological sense, but you can't just be validated,
Right.
right?
Right.
But so
Social.
I guess in that context it works, because what they had in mind is that scientists validate in the labs their own individual scientific beliefs. So I guess it's the word works. Is it clearer?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, and there is one big question, and maybe my answer will be a bit deceiving, but well, the question is, why didn't they define scientific rationality when talking about it? This question stems from the fact that when you read, again, traditional demarcationist approaches, you see a lot of references to scientific rationality, or to be rational, or to be reasonable, or to reasons, this sort of all these words. The concept of rationality is not properly defined. So I had two hypotheses. Maybe you you're gonna have ideas, but this is why I say it's a bit maybe deceiving. My true hypothesis is that either they believed it's a self-evident concept, like everyone should know what rationality means and what to be rational means, because we use that word in many contexts in daily lives, in everyday life, or maybe they just didn't care because they were concerned with something else. They didn't really need to define rationality because it was not at the core of what they tried to do when describing the nature of science. So I have identified these two hypotheses. I haven't really made a choice between these two. Maybe it's an alternative hypothesis. We can maybe discuss that later. But I made this slide because at this point I have seen no proper definition of scientific rationality in that classic literature. In philosophy of science, not in epistemology, but in philosophy of science. All right, so I have tackled, and I hope this is you agree with my conclusion. So my conclusion at this point, now that I have seen all these three ideas, is that philosophers of science in classical approaches refer to scientific rationality. They seem to have an assumption that rationality has something to do with individuality, like the individuality of scientists. Maybe let me rephrase that. The idea that rationality has something to do with how scientists on their own as individual work and do things and believe things, and that they did not define the concept. So I guess we need to do it, and this is what I try to do. And I tackle the idea of rationality with the title was really long, but so the interactive theory of reasoning. Oh, well, it's written here. Interactionist, not interactive. Interactionist theory of reasoning, which is a theory by the two persons I mentioned earlier, so Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, who are two cognitive and social psychologists. Before I really tackle their and present their theory of psychology, it's also a theory of evolutive psychology, so it's going to be really funny to have your opinion and see your faces when I describe it, because, well, as philosophers of science, it's always funny when we have a theory that is evolutive, and when evolution is referred to as like the big main argument, because sometimes it make certain scientists hide certain questions that we try to tackle. But anyway, before doing that, I just want to present to you the results of my research on the concept of rationality, not in philosophy of science, but in epistemology. And well, you find I'm gonna present everything here. So you basically have the idea that rationality is based on, that to be rational is to use a certain way, to use reasons a certain way, and let me do that. So in my research, I tried to define rationality. What I discovered first is that it looks like a thick concept. So thick concepts are terms that involve a normative evaluation and a non-evaluative description. So basically, these are terms that are both normative and descriptive. So I give a few examples, like open-minded or gullible, that refers to something that looks like null, but also descriptive. And it seems to be a word, a concept that's a bit like that. And when you tackle the history of the concept, what I needed to do here is to show that philosophers, epistemologists, use the words and define the word rationality as a certain way of using reasons. So basically, we can have a lot of different reasons. There are good reasons, bad reasons, whatever good or bad means, because this is the work we need to do later. And to be rational is to use good reasons, or to use reason in a good way. And this is an idea defined in Aristotle, in Harvey Siegel, but at the end of this research, what I needed to do is to have a proper conception of what reason means, right? So maybe it was not explained in a very good way, but what I wanted to conclude here is that when we try to define rationality, we find the idea that rationality is related normatively to reasons, but it still doesn't really define what a reason is. So this is how I tackle the question. So yeah, to be rational it has to have good reasons. And so here is the interactionist theory of reason or of reasoning by Gumercier and Dansperber. They describe it in their book, which is called The Enigma of Reason. And basically their idea is that reason is lazy. This is what they claim. They claim that the reason doesn't allow us to think better on our own, and it doesn't improve our recognition, or it doesn't improve our knowledge or our decisions. And it's very counterintuitive and against the tradition. Because traditionally, at least in psychology of reasoning, there has been the intellectualism, so intellectualist tradition, and they define their theory against that tradition. So what they believe is that reason's function is not to improve the knowledge and actions of the sole reasoner, and you understand that better when you have a few elements about what they call the rationality wars, not what they call, but what is called the rationality wars. So basically, when the psychology of reasoning started at the beginning of the 20th century, there was the idea that to be rational was to reason in a deductive way. And there's been a lot of works between logic and psychology. Both disciplines were really intertwined in a lot of different researches. But in the 60s, there started to have empirical studies in psychology of reasoning, starting with the Bayesian selection task, where we know a little bit about it. And the results show that people, participants, when confronted to similarly easy logical tasks, fail to solve them. And so the rationality was the war of different interpretation of what rationality means, because there were two dogmas in psychology of reasoning, which is that one, everyone intuitively believes that reason is supposed to improve one's knowledge and one's decision and one's individual cognition. And on the other hand, when we present to people very easy enigmas and stuff like logical tasks, people fail. So there has to be a wrong assumption in the theory, in the tradition. And this is the answers to the task, but maybe we can tackle that later because it's not so important at this point. But so they developed a theory against that intellectualist tradition, defining reason's function as argumentative. So what they say is that reason forms post hoc justification and evaluates others' reason. And so in their thesis, reason has two roles. So the first one, as I just said here, is to evaluate who to trust. So the idea is that people sometimes are honest, sometimes they lie. And so it's important, maybe for one's survival. Here we have the evaluative part, to know who and what to trust. And the second function of reason is to improve the communication between a communicator and an audience. And so reason produces arguments to give the audience good reasons to trust him or her, and the audience will use reason to evaluate the arguments, accepting the good ones, rejecting the bad ones. So now you have the general idea of their theory. And how it works, and how they develop that, well, they started with collecting empirical results. You have a lot of different topics in which we have empirical data. I selected 3 here, but so the main idea is that we have results showing that people do poorly alone when given abstract tasks, abstract non-argumentative tasks. People are pretty good at evaluating the quality of arguments. So when you give people different sorts of arguments, they usually select, or they are usually convinced by the best ones. For instance, when you give data, empirically based arguments and arguments of authority, they will usually reject the authority arguments. And you also have results showing that people do very well in groups. So for the same tasks, for instance, weights and selection tasks, people are really bad when trying to solve these tasks alone. But when you put them in groups, in small groups of 4, 5, 6 persons, and they have the opportunity to argue with each other, the best arguments, the best answer tend to emerge from the discussions. And this is how they get to the idea that the function of reason is to produce arguments after one have a conclusion and evaluate others' arguments. Let me tackle that right now. I'm just gonna drink a little bit of water because I'm talking way faster than when I trained. Okay. So I still need to give you a few hints about the theory. One of them is when they say that one of the function of reason is to evaluate the arguments of others, you want to ask, okay, but they might be good at evaluating the quality of an argument, but with what standards in mind? And what they describe is that we as humans have good intuitions, in fact, good representation about what would count as a good argument for the people in front of you. So what they say is basically you are convinced of an idea and you are able to represent what's going to be a good argument for the audience. And this is the role of reason. It is to select a good reasons for convincing the other people. So it's in other words, it's a choice that is not truth conducive driven, but more convincing driven, if I can use this sort of these words. And they also, and that's another part of the empirical data that I should have presented. In the empirical data in the psychology of reasoning, researchers show that people, whatever their background, are basically biased with the confirmation bias, which they call the my side bias, and even scientists are biased that way. And this is where the interactionist part of the theory comes, because on the contrary of the tradition, which believed that since reason was supposed to improve one's knowledge as an individual, it was a real problem to see the results that people seem to be biased, because how can you explain that from the evolution perspective? Like how does that happen that humans are biased, but on the other side they are biased one of their cognitive abilities is biased, but though its role would be to improve one's knowledge, was a bit of a problem. And in that theory, they describe this my side bias as something virtuous. And how they describe it is to show that, based on empirical data, groups tend to get better results than individuals. So when you give certain tasks to people on their own, they reason, but they get to the wrong answers, and through discussion in small groups, they get way better results for the same sort of tasks. What they say is, the best interpretation is to see demarcating bias as a virtuous product of evolution, which allows a cost-effective labor division. So, this is the fun part. They say that people have demarcating bias because the way it's cost-effective is that if in a small group of persons interacting with each other, everyone is biased toward their own intuitive conclusion, but also very good at identifying the quality of others' arguments, and that everyone argue and discuss, in the end the best argument should survive. So this is how it was selected in the evolution of human species. Right? So I said it was the fun part. And in one of their chapters,
I missed the fun part.
Sorry?
I missed the fun part.
You missed the fun part. Okay, well, we can get back to it later. But in one of their chapters, they say that this is why science works so well, because they believe that science works really well. I don't have an opinion yet on the question yet, but they believe science works really well. It is because they say scientists, or indeed data shows that scientists have demarcating bias, so they will always find arguments confirming their own intuitions and what they want to convince people of. But what happened is that science is a very interactive context in which we ask scientists to give the best argument possible, and possibly one possible an empirical argument. We ask scientists to give the best evaluation and the harshest evaluation of others' arguments and justifications and data sets and the way they collected the data and so on. This makes science a very interactive context in which people can be biased towards their own intuitions and conclusions, so they can be confirmed biased, because in the end it's a context that will make the best argument emerge, and this is how science works, right? I do not say that this is what I defend, but this is how they interpret science in the light of their theory of the interactionist theory of reasoning. I also added another idea, because I think that it's very close to Edouard Machery's idea of the search for eminence in science. So in his last paper, I forgot the name, but I can give you that later. But in his last paper, in which he defends that we should be agnostic towards science, I think it's it's related to trust in science. And he says that the problem in science is that people working in science are searching for eminence. They need people to recognize their quality, and so we have reputational incentives, and this is what makes bad science. And I thought it's very close to the ideas. This is why I put it here, if it allows you to better understand my point. So this was the theory of the interactionist theory of reasoning. I hope it's clear, but if you guys have questions of clarification, you can ask me now, or maybe we can discuss that later. But if I was a bit chaotic, well, don't hesitate to ask me. So, with that in mind, so just to sum up a little bit what I did up to now, I showed that there is an idea of individual rationality in philosophy of science without the proper definition of scientific rationality. I tackled the idea of rationality as a term that is both descriptive and normative. And I said that concept I believe, so to be rationality refers to a certain way of using reasons, and that it's probably what philosophers have in mind when discussing scientific rationality. It is because everyone has access to reasons, but scientists have good reasons because they use a certain method and all. I presented to you a theory of human reasoning or human reason as an ability of the human mind that is not, whose function is not to improve one's knowledge and one's cognition, but to improve the knowledge of a community. And that this is how the authors explain the biases, the observation of the my-side bias for everyone, even for scientists. So now, what I'm going to do is build a philosophical account of what I presented up to now. I'm just going to check how much time I have left. Oh, that's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Do we have another definition of reason except this theological one, or
Except this, sorry?
this the one you gave now about the fact that reason has the function to provide, etc.
Well,
So
you have many definitions of reason in epistemology. I didn't tackle them because what I wanted to do is to have an empirically informed account. So I wanted to see what the scientists, what the people who study reason empirically describe it. And this is the interactionist theory is one of the latest theory. I didn't say that it is immune to objections. In fact, I'm going to present to you a bit later objections from philosophy and from psychology between the two towards that theory. But this is one of the last ones. And in fact, just for the anecdote, so I went to meet one of the authors, so Hugo Mercier, for 2 months in Paris, and when I discussed with him, I said, okay, is there a new theory replacing it? How has your theory been accepted in the community of psychology of reason? And he said that it's very hard to observe how well a theory is accepted. First, because he says most psychologists are not interested in reasoning, so it's a very sort of a niche field of research. And another reason is that the different subdomains in psychology do not discuss with each other, and so it doesn't allow to have a good improvement of theories and good replacement, improvement of the different theories. So just to answer your question, there are certainly definitions of reason in philosophy. I wasn't interested in that. I wanted a empirically based definition. They start with a huge problem in the tradition. I presented to you the problem with the fact that with the results starting from the 60s, and they propose an interpretation that is coherent, acceptable considering the different empirical data that we have since the 60s. And this is one of the latest theories.
yeah, thank you.
No.
Yeah.
Just if you want to see other propositions, go in behavioral economics.
Okay.
That's a complete domain that try to use all the results of psychology of the 60s, 70s, 80s to build reason. Because none of the definitions the philosopher proposed survive the 60s, 70s, 80s empirical studies. None of them.
Mm-hmm. 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 And maybe that's one of the reasons why psychologists have these sort of arguments that are such as evolutionary arguments, because this is, for them, it's really one of the big arguments is that it's explainable with evolution, right? To say that how the human species tended to, in its theory of history of evolution, tended to be my-side biased. It is because my-side bias allows a division of cognitive labor. So this is the epistemic interactionism. So the account I try to build and develop upon all the different elements I gave you to tackle the question of both the nature of science and most especially the problem of demarcation. Okay, so how can we use it to look at the problem and distinguish science from pseudoscience? And the principle that principle that I have suggested, proposed, and maybe probably will have to evolve a little bit and to be more detailed, refined. But the principle is that scientific rationality in the account I defend is primarily a property of social argumentative practices rather than isolated individuals. So to be rational means to justify one's claim in an interactive context of argumentation. And in the light of this principle, I believe that it's possible to describe scientific rationality with the idea that to be scientifically rational means to justify one's scientific claim in an interactive context of scientific argumentation. Well, interactive context of argumentation. Yeah. This account is, well, I have a few things to say about it. Of course, the first one is that it is influenced, and by that it is probably at that point very close to contextualist solutions to the problem of demarcation, which my thesis director Sartenard proposed 3 years ago, or to Longino's interpretation of the nature of science. So these are two, I believe, up to now, big and very close sorts of contextualist solutions to the problem or to the nature of science. And well, it's a way to describe my account as, of course, in a contextualist solution. In that account, what I describe is that, in one of the ideas that in science, well, that's the scientific the idea is that the scientific context is the right environment for the development and the use of reason, right? So if we take the interactionist theory of reasoning that I just described in psychology, what they said is that reason has evolved a certain way, and that in science is the perfect environment for the use of reason, and this is what I suggest we should buy. One of the premises that we should buy. So that science is one of the right environment for the use of reason. And the other thing that we need to do is to take out the question of what the standards of rationality are, and in that context, I adopt a gradualism. This is not very clear, but I think I forgot what I had to say at that point, so it will probably come back later. Yes, sorry, go.
So, what's the argument about the right environment? So you're saying that science is what is like the right environment for reason to be sort of at its best because of the evolutionist interpretation?
Yeah. So, because of the principle. So, okay, let me make this right. It's me. I didn't describe it in a very good way. So let me do that again. According to this principle, to the principle I defend in that account, to be rational means to justify one's claim in an interactive context of argumentation. So a good context is a context that best allows one to justify one's claim and to be in an interactive context. And with that in mind, what I defend is that among other contexts, the scientific one is a context in which it is possible to be in interaction with others actually in an argumentative, interactive context. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Okay, I have more questions, but afterwards.
Okay. Okay. So, give me a second. One of the ways I built this account is by buying one of the property that Sartre defined, which is scientific stringency. So in his contextualist approach of the problem of demarcation, he says that one of the way to the way he describes we should distinguish science from pseudoscience is by observing the level of stringency a context has, and whether one context of the others plays by the rules of the stringency standards accepted in one context. So I'm going to give you an example. In everyday life, if someone tells you that the bus arrives at 5 p.m., you don't have the same stringency standards as in a scientific lab, for instance. And the way he describes contextualism is that scientific stringency is really important, because the problem of pseudoscience is to say that they adopt the level of stringency expected in a scientific context while not playing by the rules, and so in fact adopting this level of stringency. We can get to that later. So this is how he described it. So he said that the effect that a plethora of counter possibilities to any knowledge claim ought to be taken seriously or equivalently deemed relevant to fixed elimination by the evidence. So this is how he describes stringency. And, well, at this point, I see two different versions of epistemic interactionism. There is one strong version and a pragmatic version. And the reason is, I am not sure that we are able, and that is, reasonable to adopt and take seriously the interactionist theory of reasoning stemming from cognitive psychology. There are in fact very huge objections, but I still think that it's possible to exploit it as a sort of model to think and try to distinguish science from pseudoscience, and so to use it as a model to tackle the debate. So in the first version, so in strong epistemic interactionism, it's the idea that we should take the interactionist theory of reasoning to the letter. So reason has actually a social function that has been selected through evolution. So the idea is that behind that is that it's really how reason works, and so it's really how we should describe and consider scientific rationality. The problem is that a strong interpretation of it sounds relativistic, because the norms of acceptability of a given argument rely uniquely on a group. Remember when I said that, according to the authors, when one evaluates the quality of an argument, it does it by representing in one's mind what the audience would qualify as would consider a good argument. Well, it sounds a bit relativistic because there are no given standards, and then in that context, the scientific knowledge cannot pretend to be truth conducive. So it requires to buy different sort of premises that come with this sort of relativism, and I try to avoid that. It also raises the question of, does any context with any people interacting count as scientific? And so in that context, well, not in that context, but in that objection, another question is, what's the place of expertise? Does any context with anyone, any sort of background knowledge count as scientific because it would be rational enough, because interactive enough? probably we need to buy other properties to describe it, to refine our description. It's also not very obvious how the my side bias could be always virtuous, because it's really possible to imagine a lot of cases in which it really is not. So it's sort of assumption from the psychologists that I mentioned earlier, that my side bias has to be a virtuous good thing evolved in the history of the human species. But so strong epistemic interactionism is a descriptive version of the account I define, because it says how science actually is. And I don't think we can, I'm not sure we can really adopt that. But another way to do it, another way to adopt epistemic interactionism is by having a pragmatic version of it. In the pragmatic version of it, interactionism works as a model pragmatically useful in our purpose of distinguishing science from pseudoscience, because it allows to visualize them as interactive contexts, and visualizing them as interactive contexts answers the purpose of demarcation. I'm gonna describe it in the next slides. And so it's rather normative, because it at best describes how science ideally should work. And this is the demarcating part, where I try to use epistemic interactionism, the pragmatic version of epistemic interactionism. So when you use these accounts to tackle the problem of demarcation, you first view a given theory or claim as being part of a given context, and in that interpretation, science, pseudoscience, is a context that is not interactive enough. And why so? Because, again, in that version, pseudoscience does not constrain the exchange of arguments in a sufficiently stringent way. All right? So the idea, well, I will get to the end of this slide and I'm going to sum up. But so the reason why it's not sufficiently stringent, pseudoscience is not sufficiently stringent, is because there is no interest in being in a stringent interaction. And if you take an ideal scientific context, you would expect from the ideal scientist to be totally open to the idea that a research program or a research question should be in front of a very good argument to which you are not able to answer as a project that you should abandon, right? But when you have other sorts of interests, career, financial, or reputational, which is probably the case in homeopathy or herbal medicine, or at least a part of herbal medicine, you have different sort of interests that tend to block the stringency of the interaction between the different people arguing together. Another reason is that when you look at scientists and how they try to interact when they interact with the people, as scientists, we do things like what I'm doing right now, which is trying to present an account or an idea to an audience. Then the audience will be very harsh in trying to showing how it's very hard to defend and giving me counter arguments, but expecting that I counter argue and so on, so as to try to make the best argument survive. At least this is how it ideally works in that account. But if you guys had no interest in having a good argument because it could mean the end of what we are doing, and so maybe the end of your career, which might be the case for homeopathy, like a homeopath, is if one has a very good argument showing that it's not a science, that it would mean the very end of what he and the community are doing. So there is another property and another interest that cuts the potential stringency of the interaction. I have French words that come to my mind. It's really hard. Try to translate them. It's sometimes a bit hard. And so, in that interpretation, to the question of is pseudoscience irrational? Well, I answer that even if pseudoscientists do have reasons supporting their claims, and sometimes they might have good reasons or convincing reasons with their small collective community of people doing the same thing, these reasons do not stem from a sufficiently interactional context. I should have mentioned that an interactional context, as studied by psychologists, is a context in which you have a small number of people interacting. So, for instance, a conference that I would give in front of 10,000 people, but with no interaction, like just a 2-hour conference and no Q&A and nothing else, is not interactive. But 3 people having a coffee break for 15 minutes discussing their research is an interactive context. And
So X is not interactive.
Sorry?
X is not interactive.
X is not interactive.
Social Twitter.
Twitter.
Oh yeah, okay.
Twitter is irrational.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the first time I hear X as the new name in the because I still have Twitter in my mind. Yeah, that's right, exactly. And just to end this presentation, I hope we can have a lot of questions because I have probably many different other things to explain to you. But just to end on the note on the concluding notes, I like to present at least 3 assets of the pragmatic epistemic interactionism. The first one is that in the interpretation I have of it up to now, I think that it solves the error challenge. The error challenge is the challenge of distinguishing bad science from pseudoscience and fraud. Because you could totally, in my conception, you could consider that you would have a bunch of scientists doing a theory, let's randomly call it string theory, and and you could picture them as being scientists having no other interest than trying to counter-argue against each other, being the most interactional possible, discussing it at lunch breaks, giving conferences, so to be in a highly interactive context. But the problem is that if you're in an interactive context with too few people, so not the rest of close communities of people trying to develop knowledge but again in close and connected aspects of it. So for instance, in that case, to other physicists, and then it's just interactive but not interactive enough. And so this is why I suggested gradualism in the standards of how to evaluate the interaction of a group, because you could have this gradualist view that you would have an ideal context of interaction, and then you could place the different scientific contexts along the line of from very interactive to not interactive enough to count as science and hence reliable, because you, in a longinus perspective, you wouldn't have enough people from different backgrounds and from different with different norms in mind to discuss together and to bring about something that could count as a sort of objective way of discussing and exchanging ideas. So that's the first asset of it. I think it allows to better solve the area challenge. The other one is more educational, didactic, is because when you consider the traditional and also recent approaches to the problem of demarcation, for instance, in the recent approaches, you have the multi-criteria, so you have, for instance, 50 different criteria, and then you just have to check whether a scientific discipline checks the different properties, giving them coefficient, and then having a score to evaluate whether it's scientific or not scientific. I think it's really not easy for lay people to evaluate whether a theory or a discipline or a claim counts rather as probably scientific or probably non-scientific. I believe that if you tell people that what they should look at is whether the people that are claiming the claim they are in question, the claim that they are analyzing, are in an interactive context, I think it's way easier for lay people to evaluate, to assess that. As you can see on the internet, you see very easily if there are counter-arguments, and if the people who are concerned by it answer these counter-arguments or just do as if they did not exist. And the third asset, but probably not the best one, or the one I explained the best, is that one of the ideas that I don't like in the traditional approaches in philosophy of science, the problem of demarcation, is that there is a sort of disdain for the people who believe in pseudoscience. This is why I referred in the first slide to considering science as irrational belief, and saying that philosophers of science and scientists readily recognize a pseudoscience when they see one. I think there is a sort of disdain in that, and I don't really like it, because I think that behind a pseudoscientific claim or practice or discipline or theory, there are reasons, there are people who will argue, and so if you ask someone why they believe in whatever pseudoscientific, obviously pseudoscientific theory, they will have an answer, they will have reasons, right? They will believe they're rational because there are no really well-defined standards of rationality. But what we can evaluate is whether the way they got these reasons was in an interactionist context. And this is how we can evaluate whether it's rather scientific or pseudoscientific. And I think it allows to sort of be against this disdain that I think I have observed in many approaches during my research. And so just to conclude here, and I think I am on time almost, okay? So I'm going to do it very quickly. Epistemic interactionism, according to epistemic interactionism, a context is scientific when interaction is sufficiently high. That is, when people discussing quick interactions have an incentive to give the best possible justification for the claims, and have an egoistic interest to produce stringent counter-arguments against their peers. Because we as philosophers and working in academia, we are praised when we have very good counter-arguments against our peers. On the problem of science and pseudoscience, science and pseudoscience are distinguished by the degree of interaction in each context. This is the last slide I discussed with you. And why pseudoscience fails? Well, it's because it adopts too low interaction practices that are incompatible with the stringent presuppositions of a rational, hence interactive context. And that is it. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take 5 minutes break.
go back to the very last slide. Yes,
The,
there.
here?
No. Where we
Conclusion?
say pseudoscience phase. I was trying to understand, what do you mean exactly when you say pseudoscience phase?
Pseudoscience, well, what I mean by failing is that it fails to be considered what it claims to be, because the principle of a pseudoscience, I said that at the beginning, is to claim that it is scientific, so it plays by the rules of science, whatever the rules are, and it fails to actually check the properties of what a scientific context is. So this is what I mean by failing, but maybe it's not a very good choice of words. But what I mean is that by failing is that why pseudoscience is not scientific. It is because it's not interactive enough.
Yeah, but there is a difference, I think, between these two meanings. So what I mean is actually that pseudoscience fails in appearing like a real science.
No, to be.
To be.
a science.
Yeah, no, I have the same problem with that.
According to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I was trying to figure out. Okay.
You think there is because I'm really interested in, if you see a problem, don't hesitate.
No,
Because
so you mean that if pseudoscience would adopt a more interactive practice, it would emerge clearly that the approach it is following is not the correct one, then it would transform into real science. Is this that you are saying that?
not in that way. It's rather that if pseudoscience were more interactive, it would play by the rules of rationality. And that if you play by the rules of rationality, then you are authorized to be called science if in the view that that scientists are rational, or that science is rational.
Rational.
In that context, yeah, in that conception.
Yeah, but you see that the focus is on the appearance of
That's
this
not the appearance. He redefined rationality according to his definition of rationality. Science or pseudoscience that managed to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the problem of because, yeah, if you take an everyday life context in which you would exchange reasons on whatever subject, you wouldn't call that pseudoscience, even though you have a very low interaction. I mean, when you discuss with your parents, I don't know, at a dinner and on whatever topic, and you exchange reasons, you wouldn't say that it's really interactive in the way I described it here, because to be interactive, you know, many people and no interest, and well, and the thing is, you and your parents, when you discuss, you do not claim that you're scientific, so you don't claim to be rational in that way. The problem of pseudoscience and of homeopathy, for instance, is not that it claims to be some weird stuff about water, but that still looks like it works, though we are not sure, but whatever. They really claim that they are a proper science with studies describing causal mechanisms. So they really want to make the impression they would count as any other theory, and so that they have the same level of truth conduciveness or reliability, let's say reliability. And if you consider reliability to be dependent on rationality, then it's not rational enough.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But
Thank you.
just add, it's not a question, but I think maybe one of the fact that you're close to Longino, so you need, one of the criteria is that this community to play the interaction must be diverse enough. People must disagree, they must have different bias.
Yeah.
So that's one of the main difference. If you don't, if you're too homogeneous, even if you try to be the interactionist, you don't manage to be interactionist in spam
Yeah.
sense. If everybody already has the same bias at the same time, they all believe the same thing.
Yeah, I think when the two psychologists defined their interactionist theory, they have in mind that there is a sort of that randomly people will have different intuitive conclusions because they have a lot of chapters about how we have huge intuitions in everyday life, and even scientists, and how we get to these conclusions intuitively, how it works, and they say that reason activates afterwards. So you have an intuition, and the way you have intuitions is by using certain heuristics, and they seem to assume that everyone has different sorts of heuristics or uses different sorts of heuristics in the same context, and this is why people with different intuitions will have different conclusions, different arguments, and so the best one will survive. This is how they describe it.
Max?
Yeah, thanks. It's very nice to see, because I saw this before, but in a shortened version, so it's nice to see it a bit longer. But since you said that harsh criticism is sort of what makes science, I'm going for it. Basically, my point is that I don't think that your criteria is empirically adequate. I don't think it's founded on empirical reality, because you define science and pseudoscience from an a priori definition of what those things are. I didn't see a description of what scientific interactions look like. You sort of hinted at some things, but at some point you said, well, in the ideal scientific context, that's not empirical, that's ideal. And I don't understand how that has much to do with pragmatism, if it's ideal. And also your definition of homeopathy, which it seems to be your main target, goes completely undefined, and we don't really know what homeopathy is about. I personally think that homeopathy is bullshit, but because it's bullshit. It's not because they don't interact, it's just bullshit. The actual content.
You're a classical Russian.
Yeah, that's the actual content. And so I think you can find 1,000 counter examples that completely flip your argument around. So you have, the history of science, you have phlogiston theory, you have paranormal photography in the early 20th century, you have fetal sociology in the mid-20th century, you have Twitter, you have industrial chemistry, all of those.
How are they counter examples?
Because all of those are places where you have sufficiently high interactions,
Yeah.
so it's just a matter of quantitative numbers, just like amount of interactions, and some of them are now considered as pseudoscience. You can say that industrial chemistry, because it sort of denies that there is climate change, is it's interactive enough, so it's science, but it sort of goes against the goals of sort of the main scientific community saying that we should do something about it. So and then there's sort of the other way around, right? Like I don't interact with most people in this department, but with ecologists, I don't interact with logicians, I don't interact with economists, I don't interact with lawyers. Do that makes my or theirs rationality less rationality? And so I just don't think, when you say that your ground is empirically grounded, it's empirically grounded in one very specific context, which is psychology,
Yeah.
which has very specific limitations. And so when you say that, like you define homeopathy, saying, well, it's not interactive because its career, financial, and reputation are sort of leading. Like I don't do this because it's like, I make a living. You know, so I also have my career stake at sort of defining homeopathy first, not by what they actually do, by their bullshit science, but by sort of this sort of social, but then defining science by that it just works. It feels like your account presupposes the distinction that then you actually assess. So they just come completely before. There's no actual demarcation. The demarcation is made and then the account comes after.
Well, so you had different things, so I'm gonna answer to a few ones. But first of all, thank you, and I think you hold something. You hold something that I'll need to include in my thesis. But okay. So you said, the way I used the reason why I called my interpretation pragmatic is because I use the interactionist theory as pragmatically to tackle the problem of demarcation. So not in a pragmatist theory of science or truth or whatever, but just because I use it as a model to tackle a certain problem. So this is why I called it. But because the first name was weak version, I didn't want to call it the weak version because it looked a bit weird. You are totally right that I called it an empirically informed account. It's empirically informed only on the question of rationality. So probably it requires a rebranding. So yeah, I totally buy that. There are two more philosophical answers. The first one is to your objections. The first one is that if you take the phlogiston or other eugenistic, so pseudoscientific or theories, past theories, and you're right, you want to say people interacted, they wrote papers, they presented the research papers and all. I have that bad arguments, I don't like to use it, so, but I'm going to do it anyway, but it's probably not a good an answer that's good enough. But I would say that you should give interaction a bit of time, I guess. So if you don't take interaction if you take interaction in a diachronic vision, you give it enough time. With the exchange of arguments, in the end, the best one will survive. But the reason why it didn't work is because you had different other social incentives, racist incentives, or whatever that would make the interaction not work enough. How do you say in English? Court-circuité.
Short circuit.
Short circuit. Okay, that would short circuit interaction. So that's a first bad answer to your objection. It is to see it in a diachronic way. And the last answer is to your objection on homeopathy. In fact, homeopathy is really not my use case, but I'm working on a use case which is herbal medicine, because it's really interesting because you have three big different dimensions. You have how people use it traditionally, and so there is no claim to whatever scientificity. Then you have pseudoscientific, then you have research in labs. Anyway, so I have another use case, and homeopathy is really not my target. But you said that you don't see really the differences in the interests or incentives between people working in homeopathy and people working in scientific labs. And I would say that at least in science, or in, I would say, not recent sciences, people are praised for finding good, big, huge counter-arguments. I don't think it happens in something like homeopathy, because you have no interest in finding an argument that you believe your peers will not have an answer to.
Yeah, but
the arguments might the arguments might be empirical.
Yeah, but I think this characterization of science and homeopathy is not empirically. I haven't seen it.
Okay. So you think that's
you rely on an idealized version of both science and pseudoscience, and then of course then things fit.
Okay. So what you mean is you don't think that scientists are praised for finding good counter arguments?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. I mean,
Okay.
I think the Kuhnian challenge is pretty strong still, of sort of assuming that there's different sort of scientific communities, and we all sort of work sort of separately. Sometimes, we transform, we change, but we sort of, build also a reputation and a financial dependence on staying, or also a theoretical dependence on sort of staying sort of relatively close-minded to other things, and rightly so.
Okay.
I'm not saying that we shouldn't, and so I'm just concerned with this sort of big brush of like a lot of interactions good. Like Twitter is the opposite of that. I mean, it's big
Okay.
interactions, only shit comes out. And so I'm concerned by this. The thing about interactions, like we also need to know with whom are we having those interactions, what kind of interactions we're having. And I think my problem is that you presuppose with whom we should be having those interactions. And so there's some people that you think that we should be having those interactions, but those sort of considerations are a priori. It's your ideas about like what is science and pseudoscience. And so if a funder funds physics, don't the physicists have like a financial interest but because it's the FNRS, then that's not a financial interest of somehow? That if it's me buying herbal medicine, that's a financial interest, that is not. So those are both financial interactions, but what is the right one? And I think that you're presupposing a normative account way before the empirical one.
Okay. Just a very small answer on the Kuhnian view. It is that it's a pity that I don't remember how they exactly defended it. But in the book, they tested empirically whether the Kuhnian framework works. Like, do really scientists get attached to their theories until their death? And what they claim, but again, I haven't seen the data really properly. Maybe they have bad data or something. But in the book, they say that that view doesn't work because, in fact, most scientists are really keen to let their theories go. When they confronted to good counter arguments, they are really okay with letting it go. But so this is what they would say. But I buy I totally accept what you said otherwise. Yeah, probably I have a normative assumption before everything in my account. Yeah.
Is it a follow-up? No, because we have, I think, Peter, then someone online, and so
Okay, so thanks a lot. That was an excellent presentation. It's kind of sad that you didn't do your PhD here. And very interesting points raised, and I'm also very sympathetic to the project of having a more empirically informed account of these matters and the interactionist aspect. I'm also very favorable to, or at least from the dialectical version. I really find it's quite essential for rationality in the science. But I'm very skeptical, but maybe it's not for the right reasons, but about the rationality approach that you were talking about in the beginning. So it seems like it's very difficult to, and maybe this is related to your question, but the sort of data from which you start, like the empirical data, as you used that word yourself, seem to be very like, okay, you can do some research on these things, but the way you presented it was not just empirical data, it was clearly normative statements, like that's what people are good at and that's what they're not good at, and in that situation that was helpful. I mean, these things are all very normative terms, and so how are you going to judge whether some group, like the ways in selection task is like most basic problem there. Like you can, from non-classical logic approach and so on, argue that the bad choices that people make actually are justified to some extent. If you see it from another point of view, it's actually like just reinterpret like the kind of it's the kind of statements that they are should judge whether they are true or not. You have to read them according to classical logic in order to come up with the right responses. If you read them in a more natural way, then it's not so obvious whether the outcomes that people are supposed to get are the right ones. So I'm kind of wondering whether throughout this whole project we don't need to be more careful in like seeing where the normative import is of the empirical data we're using, because it's such a project where it's all about well, it's used for normative purposes. That's why we want to demarcate. So every normative input we're going to slide in at some point is going to have an effect on potential effect on the outcomes. You get it. And I'm also kind of surprised on these so-called empirical data there, and maybe that's because I have some biases, but it seems that well, people are pretty bad at evaluating arguments. I mean, for politicians, everybody knows that with a good argument you'll never win a debate.
They're even worse at producing them.
Oh yeah, I want to believe that, but like in a debate, if you see who won the debate, it's never the one who has good arguments, because they are boring and they are not. It's often the man, first of all, white, probably well dressed, that sort of things, and whether the audience there was applauding, that kind of things. It had nothing to do with rationality. I mean, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
So, and also in groups, the reality I seem to see around me, whether it's in scientific, branches of society or much less scientific, groups don't at all go against the my side bias. They rather enforce this idea of now it's not just my side, it's our side. So I can tolerate some criticism for the things it's just me, but my group, like don't attack, you can attack an individual, I don't know, psychologist in some school, and they will act rationally, but attacking them as a kind of field in the school of psychology, well, they would be super offended and not be open to rational argument anymore. So I don't see group behavior as like countering this bias, rather enforcing it. So I'm surprised by these empirical data, and I wonder how much bias we have in like presenting them as empirical and therefore kind of more reliable or something like that. Sorry,
No problem. It's really interesting. So I feel that your objection is more against their the theory of Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, though I guess
that was about that.
though I assume that maybe I haven't been very clear and maybe I'm not clear enough in my head how close or far I am to their theory and what exactly I buy from their theory. So I think it's also a little bit against my account. But just to take your objection, so I asked the same thing to Hugo Mercier when I met him. I said exactly the same thing. How do you explain that people are convinced by very bad political arguments from politicians and all? And his answer was not really clear. Or maybe I don't remember everything he said, but he sort of said that what they describe with their theory is more how reason works in a sort of neutral context or something, but he doesn't deny that there are probably other social, cultural incentives or factors that will shortcut the way reason would normally work in a context with no interest. And of course, he doesn't deny that if someone lies in front of you and says whatever figures that with political impact that are not true, he doesn't deny that people will be able to spot it. Of course.
It's a descriptive account. That's important.
Yeah, and the other thing is that I think your objection is a little bit the one of the different one that Catarina Dutil-Novaes has, because she has written a paper on that book and on that theory. She has huge objections. I didn't have the time for a slide on it, but she has huge objections against it. I think it was 5 or 6. And it's also one of the reasons why at this point I don't think it's possible to hold a strong interpretation of the account I try to defend that would take the interactionist theory to the letter exactly for different reasons, but amongst them the ones you just mentioned. And this is why I say, well, if you just look at it at interactive context, what happens? Are we able to spot the differences? And just to rebound on your objections from earlier, that's something, and we can be against that, but it's very traditional on the problem of demarcation to consider what are commonly accepted cases of science and commonly accepted cases of pseudoscience as not as main arguments, but as cases that will help you check whether your theory or the way you demarcate work. And so if you analyze the demarcation with by looking at it as a context of interaction, do the cases of science and pseudoscience that are commonly recognized work in that model? And this is a way to validate it traditionally, and that's something I do, and that's questionable that I give it that.
Question online.
Yeah, Marco is online and says, thanks so much for your talk. I have a naive question. Is there a definition of irrational in the theories that you discuss and the interpretations you develop, or is it just defined as a lack of rationality? Is it just a negative definition? In other words, is everything that's not rational irrational, or is there a more specific target for irrational behavior? Theories.
So just to start with a point that I didn't mention, but it's in the state of the art. So in epistemology of rationality, there are different definitions and different conceptions. One of them is the opposition between rationality and irrationality, and rationality and irrationality. I think that in the accounts I defend based on the interactionist theory, it's the latter distinction that applies. So either people don't have reasons, and in that case they are irrational, or they have reasons, they are exchanging reasons with other people, so in a sort of interaction. In that case they are rational to a certain extent, to a certain degree, and what we need to do is analyze whether that degree is sufficient to certain norms, and it confronts to the objection you mentioned, Max. But so yeah, I would say that in that case probably there is no irrationality but a rationality, and rationality is evaluated in the question of degree. Yeah.
Thank you, Doan. It was a great talk. You made me interested again in the demarcation problem, and I thought it was impossible. So thank you. And I invite them each year to teach in my class about demarcation, and each time why? Not that the is not good, and it's important to discuss, but it seems a very dead end. But thank you. And I think your great idea is to move it to rationality with the objection we can have, but at least it's a new field. And it's a new way to attack the problem. And I thought I was following you until you abandoned the strong position. Because I think when you abandon the strong position, you open to the attack you just received. But I understand you don't want to defend the strong position. And let me just frame how it's absolutely analogous of what the economy, when these results arrive in psychology, cognitive psychology, the economists were the only one to pay attention to these results because they have the rational agent theory. And the one that accepts, okay, let's forget about the fact that reason is a normative, blah, 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 and the canon of reason, nobody thinks like that, almost nobody. So let's develop behavioral economy. That became a very minority position, but it's still around. And the other says, no, the people are dumb, they don't reason well, they are dumb, but we know a rational agent exists at least as an ideal, and we will continue. And I thought what was interesting is that it seems, I take time to pose my question, but just to let you carry on, that you say, okay, there was a lot of debate, demarcation, very normative. Let's switch to a descriptive approach and let's see, okay? But not Longino, not feminist, not sociology, not history, psychology. Let's use psychology as a tool. And I was, okay, interesting. And of course, the Sperber theory is very well known and interesting. Okay, good, cool. And suddenly you say, yeah, but at the end I have a pragmatic, normative, descriptive mix, and of course, Max as a shark. So immediately the weakness of this position. So why did you switch? Even if I know there's objection against ITR, but why not keep a descriptive, full-fledged approach?
Well,
why do you need to go there?
Can you go to the slide where you have the videos?
It is here. Yeah.
Of course, it will be a little bit relativistic. Descriptive, of course, okay, I agree with that. But you would say, I'm coherent,
I have an answer, but it's not very academically accepted as an answer. The real answer is that I first wanted to defend strong epistemic interaction, so the strong version, and I came across too many objections to which I did not have an answer. And so I thought, if I have to present my work in a way that is sufficiently precise in an academic context like such a presentation, I have to abandon something to which I have no good answers to the objections, because there are huge objections from psychology and from philosophy. Katarina Duttil-Novaes, I think, summarized it very well, but you have the problem of the evolutionary dimension of the argument and the interpretation of the theory. It doesn't really work, because you could totally imagine that the my-side bias has not been selected. It's just a byproduct of whatever other thing that just appears to be there anyway. And with that objection, the whole stuff crashes, because the my-side bias is so important to their theory. They need it to be something that has been selected, because everyone is biased, but with the collectivity, the best argument survives.
As a scientific theory.
As a scientific theory, yeah. But
that's why
yeah,
you move.
I guess that if you give me a few times, and so when we discuss that, when I have written my thesis in a year, I might have a position that buys more takes of the strong interpretation, and so that is closer to it. But yeah, one of the other reasons is, but it's also because again, it's not very academically okay to say it, but when I discussed with my thesis director, he said that, well, one of the problems is relativism, and you may, if you want to defend something like that, you may, but you have to answer to, and you have to buy many different premises that probably you don't want to, because it's gonna make you answer all the fields that probably you want to avoid. So I choose probably facility, easiness, and that's probably why I defended this Waked interpretation.
Yeah, because what I find your account, okay, that's a psychological theory about how we develop certain kind of cognitive capacities in group. And what you're saying, what I thought very interesting in your position is just you're saying science is just a social structure that really push these things that we develop for other reasons at their maximum. And of course, pseudoscience, blah, 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 it's not bullshit, it's just less on a gradual stuff. It's not that science is exceptional or normative, it's just, it uses what we already developed in a very efficient way to a certain point. And that's new. That's new for me about the demarcation problem. And that's a very interesting answer. Science is not magical. It's not, we become suddenly rational. Who believes that? I'm a David Hume guy, so I don't believe in rationality. Nobody ever did an argument and was convinced by an argument. And when we produce argument, it's a game. But we don't change our mind because of argument. We always change because of passion. Always. Always. Come on. Name one rational decision you took in your life. Come on, guys. But so I thought it was interesting. This switch to the descriptive. Could be descriptive history, could be descriptive, you were in psychology. Okay, so if I understand
it's probably something that I need to develop,
The relativistic part, okay, Olivier said, this is bad, because you want, if you propose that, the relativistic.
Sorry, but because why?
But because Olivier is promoter.
Right, but because why?
Because, let's just finish. Because I suppose he would say you want to have a definition that the scientists would agree with.
Probably.
If you say to them, in fact, you're just on a spectrum, relativistic, you're just refining what we do irrationally according to the old standard before they won't accept.
But it's also because it allows too much space for random and not common standards. And you still want probably the problem. I mean, one of the relativistic problems is that if you buy this strong interpretation, how do you determine and qualify the norms according to which scientists evaluate the arguments that are given?
But they are changing.
Yeah.
Look at science 200 years old, you would say, oh my God, what is that?
Yeah, I guess so. yeah, probably.
Doesn't mean they are completely arbitrary. Doesn't mean
because there are
anything
certain norms that remain. For instance, empirical data usually, well, it remains.
for the last 500 years, and not in mathematics.
Yeah. Well, just to answer your questions, to answer your question, probably there are reasons and ways to defend the first interpretation. I still not have the solution, and this is why I wanted to defend something that was safer, but also less ambitious. Yeah, probably.
And you have to resist Max.
Described as the shock.
That's clear during your defense. You will have these two kind of objections. It's obvious.
Yeah.
If it's not answered in the dissertation, there will be someone that will say that. You have to be ready.
as that.
Yes, thank you very much. My question actually turns out to be a follow-up. So it's actually two questions. First is, it's just not very clear to me what counts as relevant interaction, and whether they have written something in psychology on this, because it seems that it must be something like conversation, so it must be a two-way interaction, something like this. But whether they put any criteria, and whether it should be in-person interactions, it can be, I don't know, writing letters or reading and changing your mind. Does this count as a relevant kind of interaction? And so I think this in itself is sort of a question I have, but it's also connected to the second question I have, is that how large you want your notion of science to be historically sort of vast? Do you want it to be like starting from mid-20th century science, which is okay, or it should be something like starting from the scientific revolution, or it should go back to, I don't know, Greeks and ancient Mesopotamia or something? Or it doesn't matter, and you think that you can tweak the parameters, so you sort of will select different sciences, but it's okay, or you think it's important sort of relevant distinction, sort of to say, let's say, this social structure of science which started in 16th century, this is what is captured well, and before that it was something else. Or,
and what you just mentioned is one of the big problems in the problem of demarcation, is that whatever the demarcation you suggest, you have to be clear whether it applies to all sciences, and of course there is a problem that it didn't happen the same way as today, and so but so to answer your first question, what comes as an interaction in psychology, well, in the theory, in the psychological theory, so the interactionist theory of reasoning, what comes as an interaction is the number of people actively discussing and the speed of exchange. So what they qualify, because I asked that very question, and he said, well, you have different people, they have a task or a problem, whatever it is, and they just exchange ideas or things they are convinced of, give an argument, then you have another answer, and so all this happens very quickly. So this is how they define interaction, and you want to say, okay, it's not like that in many straits of science, because of course we have coffee breaks, but you still need people to be at the office.
Sorry, I just missed. You said speed of interaction and the number of.
Number of people. So they say you need more than one or two persons, but you cannot have a good interaction with 100 persons discussing at the same time, because it will mean that you will only have 1/100th of the time to discuss it. So and they take it from the empirical data they gathered, because in the experiments they put people in front of a task alone, and then in small groups of 4 to 6 people with the mission to discuss. So speed of interaction, a number of people. But then I said it doesn't happen that way in science, and this is why they opened a chapter on the description of science. By the way, I find it really funny. I think you will find it really funny too, because when I called Hugo Mercier before I went to Paris, I said I really loved your chapter on the nature of science and in philosophy of science. I find it really interesting that psychologists do something like that. And he said, we didn't do philosophy of science. We just described how we think science works. I find it really funny. But yeah, so the way they extended it to their description of science is that they see very different ways science interacts in coffee breaks, in lunch, in presentations, because we have Q&As. And in my account, I think we need to, and so this is my personal take, I think we need to extend our description of what interaction means, because you want to say that when you publish a paper, you sort of interact with people, even though it's a bit indirect, but it's another way of interacting. Of course, I don't have a clear idea of whether it's more or less interacting than discussing quickly with other people. I think it's less, but anyway, it's a way of interacting because you submit a paper, then you have a revision, so different people, you will revise it, give you answers and counter arguments, or saying something is not clear enough, so we'll try to be clearer, answer the objections, so it's not a way of indirectly interacting. And so this is how I would define interactions today. Yeah, I think I've said everything I had in mind about that question. But if I have other ideas, I'm gonna tell you. And the other question was the historicity of the account. Well, in the best case, and I think it's possible, my account will allow to distinguish. I mean to apply to older cases of science because it has always all the sciences, all the cases of sciences we have written traces of it, and it was written because they wanted to interact with a public, with an audience, and you can always see it as a way of interacting with people, and you can always evaluate whether it was a semblance of interaction with the means that were available at a certain time. It's easier today to interact with the rest of the world than it was 100 years ago. And so I guess this is the path I'm going to take if I want to apply it to all the cases. Because, of course, it's richer if it applies to all cases than only contemporary science, modern science. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, just... thank you for your answer. I think it clarifies a lot like what is meant by this kind of interactions. But also, I was just thinking that it seems to me resembling a bit what is at least sometimes written in the literature on ancient Greece and science in ancient Greece, because there is a work on the Hippocratic medicine, which shows that, I don't know how sort of it's evaluated by a historian of ancient science or ancient philosophy, but it seemed good to me that they argue that the sort of discipline of medicine is being born by the fact that they start engaging in argumentative interactions which were maybe borrowed from other social interactions like courts or something like this. And they also, you see the same kind of biases that Hippocratic authors, they are really good at debunking sort of religious magical explanations of different stuff, but they're really not good at self-criticizing, because when you read their theories about like balance of four elements, and you can just take what they've written in one paragraph and apply it directly to what they write in the next paragraph, but they're really bad at this, but they develop really good sort of critical thinking standards when they're trying to debunk someone else's argument.
Yeah.
So it seems to resemble a lot this sort of evolutionary description. Yeah, just thinking that may be a nice historical example.
Yeah, totally.
You make
Yeah.
your account large enough to include not only science in the last 50 years, but yeah.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, totally. Because I read a little bit about the Hippocratic medicine, because there is the research on the. I mean, we usually date in encyclopedia articles the first approaches to the demarcation problem to Hippocratic texts. And yeah, I guess that in my account, a certain way of seeing it is to say that, well, they interacted, but they did not interact enough, and so according to the time, it was on a gradient. It was scientific in the way, it was rational in the way that it interacted, but it was not enough in a way that it's not as rational as medicine is today.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it would be possible to describe it through this lens. Yeah.
Last question.
Very sort of it's constructive. I'm buying Alexandre's proposition somewhat. So in a pragmatic way. But yes, the strong epistemic interactionism. Actually, I think what you say, the kind of rationality that you're trying to reconstruct is not about sort of science or universities in general or medicine, but actually relatively small groups. You said right between more than 2 but less than 100. So it seems like you're sort of trying to reconstruct the rationality of relatively small groups of people doing things together for relatively common goals that do interact with each other in meaningful ways. So it feels like you're kind of trying to reconstruct the rationality of laboratories, of departments, where there's some common ground. And I think I would sort of say that if you go through the strong epistemic interactionism, you have the first one takes idea to the letter, reason actually has a social function related to the revolution. I mean, you're going to always get some pushback about sort of that, but I think it's fair. I think you can defend it. The second one about relativism, I'd say embrace it fully on. I think it's fine. I think there's some relativism like Martin Kusch's relativism, which sort of, it's not anything goes, but sort of pays attention to the historicity of things. But you don't have to do history, but you can do philosophy, which is sort of historically respectful and minded, but it's sort of very much grounded. And I think Kusch might be very interesting for you here to defend a relativism that is not the things that Sartre is scared of sort of appearing like Latour. That's fine, you're not going to be Latour, it's okay. It's fine, don't worry about it, go for it. And then sort of that, I think the third point is very interesting about the context with any people interacting in scientific, what's the place of expertise. I think that's really interesting. I think it's a bit what Alexandre was hinting at, that I think that there's perhaps where the normativity also comes in. And I mean, there's other, but I feel like it feels like you're actually talking. So I'm just wondering whether the rationality that these psychologists are defining is not the rationality with capital R that you're seeking.
Yeah, okay.
It's not the reason that sort of philosophers and the antitheses were talking about. That's not. They're talking about scientific rationality of individual people in relatively small groups doing games and stuff, which is kind of what science does, right? Like puzzles and things. So I feel like that's the kind of rationality you're trying to recover. Right? So I agree with Alexander, that's the one that you should defend, not the pragmatic, because then you're going to get the kind of more critical questions about sort of, but I don't know, that's my impression.
Okay. Well, I guess it was not really a question, but more a comment, which I totally. I mean, I had to think about it, but it's really interesting. Yeah, it really improved the account I tried to defend.
Be more radical.
Yeah. Okay. I will try to.